welcome back to my channel. I'm Heather and this is the happenings with H.A.P. H.A.P. meaning my initials. It is finally here, the video you've been waiting for, I think. Last week I posted my bottom 5 books of 2020 and surprisingly did not get a lot of hate comments yet. So that was a good thing. But now I'm finally sitting down to film what my favorite reads were of 2020. I've decided to narrow this list down to 12. In theory, it would have been my favorite book for each month, but there are 2 months that I had 2 books that month that were just absolutely phenomenal for me. For the most part, it is about 1 book a month, but except for those 2 months, it's not. So there's no technical favorite for December or October. In an effort to keep this video not being 3 hours long, because we all know I like to talk a lot, I will not be doing any type of synopsis for each of these books. It's mostly just going to be how I felt about them and why they were my favorite books. I'm going to link the playlist for all of the wrap-ups on my channel down below so that if you want to know more about these books, you can totally watch those videos and get a deeper dive into each one. With that said, I am so thankful for all of you that have supported me all of 2020, and I'm looking forward to 2021. If you have not already and don't want to go into 2021 without having subscribed, hit that subscribe button down below, click the notification, give this a like. With that, I hope you guys enjoy my top 12 reads of 2020. I'm going to be going through these books in the order that I read them, so we're going to start in January 2020. I actually had 2 books this month that just blew me away. The first one was If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. This is a dark academia. It was my first actually read into dark academia, and I absolutely love this book. The way it explored drama school was something that really stuck with me because I am an actor, for those that don't know, and a lot of the weird kind of familial closeness that a group of actors get into, whether in a show or especially in drama school, was explored in this book, and that part of it was so true to life. Like, it really hit a nerve with me. I think that's why I connected to this book so much. The mystery involved was really awesome, as well as the character development. I really enjoyed all of the characters for their own weird quirks and ways, and the ending of this was insane. And I want a sequel, but I don't know if you can really make a sequel out of how that ending happened, but this was such a big surprise for me, and it was only the second book I read in 2020, and the fact that it still affects me literally a year later says a lot. So if you have not read this already, please read it. These are all going to be books basically that I'm going to be recommending from here on out, so get used to them. My next favorite read in January was the start of a series that I had heard about on BookTube and finally bit the bullet and read it and absolutely fell in love with it. I really had to think about which of the books in the series I wanted to include as my favorite, and I decided to go with the first one, and that is An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir. This is a fantasy historical fiction that is in a world based on ancient Rome, but because Sabaa Tahir is Pakistani American, it also includes nods, I'm sure, to her own traditions and cultures, especially in regards to the jinn that are presented in this. It is young adult, but really reads like almost an adult. It's pretty brutal. The first book primarily focuses on Lair and her trying to get her brother back and all of the stuff she has to go through, which is just scary. This book is a lot. You definitely have to kind of be in the mindset when you read it because there is torture and stuff like that involved in it, but the character development is so wonderful. Lair is such an amazing character, and her relationship with Elias is wonderful, and Helene, at first I didn't like her, but as the series goes on, I really love her now. I had to pick the first one because the first one just set the groundwork of the magic system involved, as well as, the character relationships, and it's so well done. This is a fantasy book that it gets talked about, but it also doesn't really get talked about a lot in comparison to other fantasy series. But if you haven't read this and want a wild ride that's much different than other type of fantasy, I recommend this one so much. The lore that's involved in the world building is just absolutely spectacular, and I can't wait to see what Sabaa Tahir writes next because I absolutely adore her. Next, we're going to move into February, and my favorite book of February was Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. Again, this is one that has been all over BookTube and Bookstagram. This was Casey McQuiston's debut novel, and it basically made the world go crazy, but rightfully so. This is an enemies to lovers queer lit between the first son, Alex Claremont Diaz, and Prince Henry, the first in line to the English throne. What I loved about this most, besides the character development and obviously the relationship that was involved, because it was a really great relationship, was the political undertones of it. What would happen if two such huge political power people got involved together, and how would that look, especially in a world that is still not that accepting of queer romances, especially in regards to politicians and, you know, the royal family. That was something I was not expecting going in, because you kind of think like, okay, it might be pretty much a fluffy type of a romance, and it really wasn't. And I love that about it. It was set in an alternate 2019 where the next president from Barack Obama was actually a woman. It also explores the kind of post-Obama era in an idealized way as well. So like there were so many layers to this book that I was just not expecting. And if you want to like read a really great romance but that has more involved in it, I would recommend this book. I'm recommending this book since I read it because I loved it that much, and I'm really excited for her next novel that's coming out in 2021. So I'm so excited. But this one was just such a huge surprise for me, and I'm so glad that it actually lives up to the hype. For real. In March, I had one of my most anticipated reads of 2020, and it did not disappoint, and that was Chain of Gold by Cassandra Clare. I am #Shadowhunter trash. I really need to make a t-shirt that says that. When it comes to the Shadowhunter series, I am just a puddle of mush. Like, I think even if I don't like a Shadowhunters novel, because there's been a few I haven't loved, I still love the overall story arc anyway. But this one was actually great. This is the start of a sequel trilogy to the Infernal Devices series, which is my favorite series in the Shadowhunter universe, and it deals with the children from the characters from that series. So I'd recommend reading the Infernal Devices before you read this, but you do not need to read any of the other Shadowhunter novels to understand what's going on, and in theory you could read this by itself. For background, I would definitely recommend the Infernal Devices series. I have an entire video on what Chain of Iron, the sequel to this one coming out in 2021, will be about. You can see my video there. It's one of my most popular videos on the channel, but I just love this. It was everything I wanted and more. I read it in one weekend, and I can't wait to binge the next one in the series, because this one just stomped on my soul and my heart, as Cassandra Clare always loves to do to me, but I still keep coming back for more. So apparently I am a Shadowhunter masochist, so take that as you will. In April, I had two favorite books, both totally different types. The first book was Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I had started to read this novel in like high school, and I just couldn't get past the beginning, and I never actually finished it. But I had bought the book years and years and years ago, and it's been sitting on my shelf forever. But I finally decided to pick it up. I was in a classics mood. I think this was the time of the lockdown, so during the beginning of it, I had watched a lot of Jane Austen, and I was really in a mood for classics. And I decided to pick this one up because I was like, why not? And I love this book. The relationships in it are so terribly toxic. They're so terribly bad. Anyone that idolized Heathcliff and Catherine's relationship, I don't know what's wrong with you. It's not good. It's not healthy. But there's something about this book that really pulled me in. Like, I think I read it in like 2 days. I was just that invested in it, and I just kept reading. It was just so good. It was just such an engaging story of obsession and tragedy, cycles of abuse and how they can be broken, and also how they're perpetuated. I really should do like a video on this, because I feel like people get lost in the Catherine Heathcliff story of their love, but not necessarily about the other characters. But it was just really a surprise, and I absolutely loved it. Like, I was shocked at how much I loved it. I'm glad I read it as an adult. I don't think I would have appreciated it as much in high school, knowing my high school self. You know, sometimes things happen for a reason. Definitely love this one a lot. The next book in April that really struck a chord with me was The Deep by Rivers Solomon. This one really surprised me, and I had to sit with it for a while after I read it to really just take everything that I had read in. It is a fantasy novella basically about how in this world mermaids were created due to slaves that were thrown over slave ships that were pregnant and gave birth after they passed. It deals with generational trauma. It deals with tradition and social identity, cultural identity, racial identity, gender identity. Like, it deals with so much, and I am really upset that more people don't talk about this book. My only critique of it really was that I wish that it was longer, because it was just so fascinating and such an interesting world that was created. Like, the world building in it is really great. It's just so good, and I just wish more people had talked about it this year, but they didn't, and that's unfortunate because it was wonderful. Like, definitely a different type of fantasy than you will have read, but there's so many layers involved in it that I was taken aback by it. Like I said, I had to sit with it for a while. Yeah, I loved it. Like, it was just so good. Next, we're going to move to May. My favorite book of that month was City of Girls by Elizabeth Gilbert. This was one that I had on my TBR for a little while because I was obviously intrigued by the cover and the synopsis, but having read it and what I actually got out of it was so much more than I could have hoped for. It focuses on the theater world of the 1940s, and as someone that is a huge historical fiction fan, I absolutely adored this book. I loved seeing New York City through that lens. At first, it definitely started off a bit cliched and was giving me major Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo vibes. Then as the narrative went on and you get to know this protagonist who is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. She does terrible things to people, but she just is. There's no real like morality lesson that ends up really happening. It's just a woman that's going through her life, and this is just kind of what ends up happening. And I love the idea of love and family in unconventional ways. That's what this novel really explores. There, you can have a deep love for someone that is literally never physical, never actually romantic, and you can have family that has nothing to do with being blood relations. I feel like that's something that's not explored a lot, and because of when the story takes place and as it moves on through the years, like, you are in the height of the American dream ideal of married, 2 kids, and a house in the suburbs, but not everyone lives to that, and that's okay. And that's one thing, like I said, I love that this book explored. It was definitely a shock for me as I kept reading it of like how much I was loving the story. And if you're a historical fiction fan, you'll absolutely adore this one. Yeah, it just was really good, and another big surprise for me this year. In June, we have one of my actual top favorite of favorites of this year, and that was Felix Ever After by Kacen Callender. This was one I was super surprised by as well. I had read Simon vs. the Homo Sapiens, I want to say either in June or May, and I had thought that this was basically just going to be in similar vein to that, but wow, no. Like... This was so much better than that book, and such a surprise with how beautiful it was, of accepting yourself and finding love that you cherish. Like, basically I mentioned Simon because I think that this should be as popular as that book, and I think it probably won't be because it is about queer people of color and the main character is a trans boy of color, which again, it's unfortunate that mostly the cis white stories get more representation, but if you haven't read this one, I highly suggest you do. It has been picked up, I think, by Hulu to be either a series or TV show, but read it. It is such a beautiful romance and deals with so much more about identity and family, friends, like all of that. So good. I can't wait to read more from Kacen Callender because I absolutely love this book, and I know you will too. So July had the reading rush where I read a bunch of other books, but the main series that I actually read in July ended up being a favorite series of mine, and that is Stalking Jack the Ripper by Kerri Maniscalco. I had to think of which book I wanted to add as my favorite, and I went with the first one again, just because of the mystery involved in it, and because it's one of also the more closely to being historically accurate of all the books in regards to the Jack the Ripper case. And I absolutely loved the characters in this, and this mystery, and the fact that Audrey Rose is definitely not your typical protagonist, especially for YA lit. Basically like a tomboy that wanted to learn medicine and do what she wanted to do. I love the enemies to friends to lovers that is Audrey and Thomas. Their relationship was the best part about the entire series. I absolutely fawned over it. I adored it. I loved it so much. What I loved about it too was the fact that it was built over time. It wasn't completely right away love at first sight, and even within the first book, it wasn't that way. I'm really excited to read more from Kerri Maniscalco because this was such a fun debut. Like, I was very shocked how much I really enjoyed it. And if you like historical fiction, you'll really enjoy this one. Historical fiction mystery. Such a fun series. It put a smile on my face the entire time I was reading this series. I just loved it. So for those that know, in August, I actually read from beginning to end the entire Diviner series by Libba Bray and absolutely fell in love with it. It was just such a good series. And I had to think about which book of the series was my favorite. While there are 4 books in the series and there is an overarching storyline, there were baddies in each individual book, but my favorite one of them all was definitely Lair of Dreams. And this one actually explored like a demon ghost in the dream world. I just thought that was so unique. This one was also one where we got to actually see more about the Diviners. The first book in the series primarily follows Evie, and as a character, I didn't love her. I got to like her a lot more as the books went on. The second one is where we get to exploring more of the other Diviners' powers. Because the second book takes place a lot in the dream world, we get way more of Henry, and we also get to be introduced to Ling, who is one of my favorite characters in the entire series, and the relationship between Henry and Ling is so wonderful. The baddie was actually like really terrifying in its own way because like how would you get out of a dream world? You really can't. And we also start getting into more of the social political climate of the time period. So this is when I think the series really started to gain some traction, whereas the first one was definitely much more of like the murder mystery, and this one started to expand the world building and that the first one started. It's definitely my favorite. Like I devoured this one so fast. Like I loved it so much. If you've read the first one and you were kind of meh about it, I would read this one since this is the second one, and I feel like you would feel better about it because from there it gets even crazier, but in the best way possible. But yeah, the Lair of Dreams is definitely my favorite of the entire series. In September, I was definitely in like a mystery mood and stumbled across another favorite of mine that I did not expect, and that is Monday's Not Coming by Tiffany D. Jackson. The twist in this book was insane. I did not see it coming at all, and I'm sure when I was listening to this in public, my mouth probably dropped open. This is one of those that you really have to be in the right mindset to read because it does involve extreme child abuse, and it deals with grief, moving on, and finding your own identity outside of your friend group. There's lots of this. Like the mystery itself was very engaging, but then all the other pieces to the puzzle as they came together was just shocking in the best way possible, but also in a tragic way. Like it's definitely not a happy book, even though it does end up a little bit okay, but it's still such a wonderful read. If you are a fan of Sadie by Courtney Summers, you would love this book a lot, like hands down. And like I said, the twist I did not see coming, but it was so good. I definitely want to read more of Tiffany D. Jackson's books, which I hopefully will be able to do in 2021. And yeah, I just absolutely love this one. And it was like another sleeper surprise that I read the synopsis and found it interesting, but then as I was reading it, I just fell more in love with it. So yeah. The last book on my list was a November read for me, and I had heard the hype about it, was unsure if it would live up to that hype, and it definitely did, surprisingly, and I absolutely loved it. It's gone in my favorites of favorite standalones that I've ever read, and that is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. I devoured this book. Like, I read it as quickly as I could, but I also didn't want to read it that fast, but I did because it was just so good. I love the historical fiction aspect of it and seeing Addie going through all of these different decades and the relationship between Luke and her, and then Addie's relationship with Henry is just, it was so heartbreaking but so wonderful. What I loved about this book too was how it explored the importance and like the permeance of art in all its different forms, whether it's visual, written, music, anything, and how much of an impression that can make on the world. That's basically Addie's whole thing, is she's not able to leave an impression on the world, yet she somehow still does, and it's such a beautiful story for that. I wanted to live in this book longer than I was able. I wish it could be a series, but it also can't be a series, and that's what's beautiful about it. But it was just so good. And like I said, the relationship between her and Luke was so toxic, but you understood why, and there was the weird power dynamic. There's just so many layers to her relationships with basically anyone she meets, but especially with Luke. I know a lot of people have said like this is V.E. Schwab's like magnum opus, and I definitely agree with that. I very much feel bad for her when she has to try to top this one, because I don't know if you even can, because it was just so well done. And this is one that should definitely be a movie or a miniseries or whatever, because something so cinematic in scope while reading it. The world building was wonderful, and the characters were so multifaceted and layered, and it was everything you could want a book to be and more. I know you probably are worried about the hype and that you won't don't like it, but this is one of the few, like the Diviners, like Red, White, and Royal Blue, Felix Ever After, where the hype is actually justified by how good the novel is. So take that for what you will, but if you are a fan of historical fiction and urban fantasy, light fantasy, you will love this book. It's so good. It was definitely like a high point to kind of close the year on a bit. Yeah, I just loved it. And there you have it. There are my top 12 reads of 2020. I had a bit of a time narrowing down this list, but I'm pretty secure in my choices. I enjoyed most of the books I read, but these were just the best of the best of the best. I'm very excited to find more new reads that I'm gonna love in 2021. Have you guys read any of these books? If you have, let me know down below. Let me know what some of your top books of the year were. Maybe I can add them to my TBR if I have not read them. I hope you guys enjoyed this video so much, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Bye.